He's an actor. That's what they were saying in the back rows. Not quietly, loud enough to carry. A performer, a showman. Put him against a real fighter and watch what happens. The year was 1964. The place was Long Beach, California, and the room was packed with the most dangerous martial artists in America. Champions, grandmasters, men who had spent decades building reputations inside the closed world of competitive fighting. They had come to see a demonstration. They were not prepared for what they were about to witness. And the man who had called Bruce Lee an actor, a thick-necked karate champion from the Midwest who had won 3 regional tournaments and believed, with the complete confidence of someone who has never been seriously tested, that he was among the best in the room, would spend the rest of his life describing the next 4 seconds to anyone who would listen. 4 seconds. That's all it took. Long Beach, August 1964. The International Karate Championships was not a small event. Ed Parker had built it into something real, a legitimate gathering of serious martial artists at a time when the American martial arts world was still finding its shape, still deciding what it was and what it wanted to be. Parker himself was a significant figure, Hawaiian-born, trained in Kenpo, politically sharp enough to understand that the art needed visibility to survive in America. He had spent years building connections, cultivating relationships, assembling the kind of credibility that allowed him to fill a room with people who actually knew what they were doing. The 1964 championships was the event that would change everything. Not because of the competition, because of the 23-year-old man Parker had invited to give a demonstration between bouts. Bruce Lee arrived without ceremony, no entourage, no announcement. He walked into the Long Beach arena the way he walked into every room, with a quality of attention that was difficult to name and impossible to ignore. Not arrogance, not performance, something quieter and more unsettling than either. Presence. The kind that makes a room reorganize itself around a person without anyone deciding to do it. Understand what he was walking into. The American martial arts establishment of 1964 was a specific world with specific politics and specific hierarchies, and Bruce Lee occupied an uncomfortable position within it. He was Chinese. That mattered more than it should have, in ways both obvious and subtle. The assumption, rarely stated openly but present in the texture of every interaction, was that Chinese martial arts were classical, traditional, museum pieces, beautiful to look at, rooted in history, but fundamentally not competitive with the hard practical efficiency of Japanese and Korean systems that had been tested in tournament competition. Karate was the dominant force. Judo had the Olympic credibility. These were the systems that serious American fighters respected, and the practitioners of those systems had a particular way of looking at someone who came from a different tradition, a mixture of curiosity and condescension, an openness to being impressed combined with the prior certainty that they would not be. Bruce Lee was also young, 23 years old, and while he had been teaching for several years and had already developed a reputation in certain circles, he had not competed formally in any American tournament. He had no trophies, no ranking within the established systems, no credential that the room would automatically recognize. He had Ed Parker's endorsement, he had his own ability, and he had the kind of confidence that doesn't need external validation because it is built on something the person carrying it has tested privately against real resistance and found to be solid. That kind of confidence reads differently than the performed kind, but it still makes people want to test it. The man in the back row had a name. We'll call him Carter. Not his real name, but the composite of several accounts from people who were present that day and described the same type. A regional karate champion, physically impressive, trained seriously, and possessed of the specific certainty that comes from being the best fighter in every room you've ever entered. Carter had entered his first tournament at 17. He had won. He had kept winning. By 1964, he had 3 regional titles and the kind of record that made people step aside when he walked into a gym. He was not a bad person. He was not a coward. He was simply a man who had succeeded within a specific system for long enough that he had begun to confuse the system with reality. He watched Bruce Lee warm up from across the room and made the calculation quickly. Small, young, Chinese, classical kung fu background, the flowing, artistic, performance-oriented stuff, not a serious competitive threat. He said it out loud. The people around him laughed. Bruce Lee took the floor. Ed Parker introduced him briefly, not extravagantly, just enough to establish context. Bruce Lee, from Seattle, demonstrating techniques from his school of Junfan Kung Fu. The room settled. The competitive martial artists in the audience arranged themselves into the particular posture of professional assessment, arms crossed, eyes sharp, the body language of people who are watching critically rather than appreciatively. Bruce Lee stood at the center of the demonstration area. He was 5'7". He weighed at that point somewhere around 130 pounds. In a room full of fighters who averaged significantly more in both dimensions, he looked at first glance exactly what Carter had said he was, a performer. Then he moved. The first thing that hit the room was the speed. Not the technique, not the power, the speed.
the raw, almost offensive speed of a body that had been trained to eliminate every unnecessary movement between intention and execution. He was demonstrating combinations, standard opening material for a martial arts showcase, nothing designed to shock, just honest technique performed at honest speed. But the speed wasn't normal. It wasn't tournament speed, which is fast. It wasn't demonstration speed, which is usually slower than real, performed for visibility. It was something else. Something that several people in that room, experienced fighters who had seen fast, would later describe as the fastest human movement they had personally witnessed. The combinations blurred. Not in the movie sense, not literally invisible, but at the edge of what the human eye can parse into individual components. You could see the beginning and the end. The middle was a suggestion. The room that had been making quiet assessments went quiet in a different way.
Then Ed Parker asked for a volunteer, a training partner, someone to work with Bruce on the more advanced demonstrations, partner drills, sensitivity work, the interactive techniques that required another body in the equation. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when a room full of confident people suddenly becomes privately uncertain about whether they want to be standing in the center of it. Carter volunteered. Of course he did. The logic was straightforward from where he was standing. If Bruce Lee was a performer, this was the moment to expose it. Real fighters didn't perform, they responded. Partner work was honest in a way that solo demonstration wasn't. You couldn't fake it against someone who knew what they were doing. And Carter believed he knew what he was doing. He walked to the center of the floor with the easy confidence of a man who has never been surprised. Bruce Lee looked at him. Just looked. For a moment that several witnesses described as longer than it probably was, the way significant moments always stretch in memory. Then he nodded and asked Carter to throw a punch. What happened next is documented in multiple accounts. Not filmed, the 1964 championships predates the era of ubiquitous video recording, and whatever footage existed from that event has not survived in any publicly accessible form, but the witnesses are consistent in ways that matter. Carter threw a straight right, his best punch, committed, real. Bruce Lee was not where the punch was going when it arrived. The movement, the evasion, was described by different witnesses using different words that all pointed at the same quality. It was not a step back, not a lean, not the kind of defensive movement that registers as defense. It was more like the space where Bruce had been simply ceased to be occupied, like the target had never existed. And in the same motion, not after, not as a separate action, but within the same continuous movement, Bruce's hand arrived at Carter's face, stopped an inch from contact. The room did not breathe. Carter's expression was described by 3 separate witnesses. Confusion first, the neurological moment of processing what had just happened, the punch that had landed on nothing, the hand that had appeared at his face without visible transit. Then something else. Not fear exactly, the thing that comes before fear when the body understands something that the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet, the cellular level recognition that the assumptions you were operating on were wrong. He stepped back. Bruce Lee lowered his hand. The room erupted. Not in chaos, in a specific kind of noise that martial artists make when they have seen something that reorders their understanding, a collective exhalation followed by voices, not cheering exactly, but the sound of 100 experts simultaneously revising their assessment of what they had just witnessed. Parker was watching from his side. He had seen Bruce Lee train. He had seen the demonstrations in private. He had invited Bruce specifically because he believed the room needed to see what he had seen, needed the disruption of it, the productive shock of encountering something that didn't fit inside their existing categories. He was watching it happen in real time. Carter stood in the center of the floor looking at his hand, then at Bruce Lee, then at his hand again. The gesture of a man trying to locate the error in his own system, trying to understand how the punch that had always connected had connected with nothing. He would try again. Bruce Lee invited him to. Calmly. Genuinely. Not with the theatrical patience of a man playing to an audience, but with the direct simplicity of someone who understands that the other person needs another data point before they can accept the first one. Carter reset. Adjusted his stance. This time he didn't telegraph, or tried not to. He had good instincts. He had trained seriously. He knew that the first punch had been too readable, too straight, too committed without variation. He tried a combination, jab to cross. The jab landed on air. The cross was intercepted, not blocked in the classical sense, but met at its origin, redirected before it had traveled far enough to carry real force, turned into nothing by a movement so small and so precisely timed that several people watching couldn't identify what had happened until they talked it through afterward. And Bruce's counter, again stopped just before contact, arrived at Carter's midsection in the window between the jab and the cross. In the space that, in a real fight,
would have ended the exchange. 2 seconds. The room had stopped performing assessment and was simply watching. This is what Jeet Kune Do looked like in practice. Not in the training room, not in a controlled drill with a cooperative partner, against a real fighter, throw in real punches, with real speed and real commitment. The interception. The principle Bruce Lee had spent the years since the Wong Jack Man fight developing and refining and embedding into his nervous system until it stopped being a technique and became a reflex. He wasn't waiting for the attack to arrive and then responding. He was reading the attack at its origin, in the shift of weight, the drop of shoulder, the microscopic tells that every fighter generates before their body commits, and moving to meet it before it had accumulated the momentum and mass that make a punch dangerous. The intercepting fist. It looked to the people watching, like prediction, like something beyond the physical. Several accounts from that day used the word supernatural, not because the witnesses believed in anything supernatural, but because they lacked a technical framework for what they were seeing, and supernatural was the closest available word for faster than my ability to process. It was not supernatural. It was 10,000 hours of work aimed at a specific problem, producing a specific result. But in that room, in that moment, the distinction didn't matter. Carter stepped back a second time. This time he didn't look at his hand. He looked at Bruce Lee. The expression had shifted again, past the confusion, past the pre-fear cellular recognition, into something that the best fighters share with the best students, the ability, however uncomfortable, to recognize when they are in the presence of something that exceeds their current understanding. He nodded. A small nod, the kind that means something specific between fighters, not defeat in the theatrical sense, but the honest acknowledgement that the data has arrived and the prior assessment was wrong. Bruce Lee nodded back. The room, which had been holding a collective breath for what felt like much longer than it was, released. And in the back row, something shifted. The voices that had said actor and performer and put him against a real fighter had gone quiet in the way that certain kinds of certainty go quiet, not loudly, not with apology, just with the sudden absence of the confidence that had produced them. They had put him against a real fighter. The real fighter was Carter, and Carter was standing in the center of the floor looking at a 130-pound, 23-year-old Chinese martial artist with the expression of a man who is just as cuffed as ever he's been using, doesn't match the territory. The afternoon was not over. There were more demonstrations to come, and the room, which had arrived with its hierarchies intact and its assessments already made, was no longer the same room it had been 20 minutes ago.
The second half of the demonstration was different. Not louder, not more dramatic in the theatrical sense, but denser, the way a conversation gets denser when everyone in the room has stopped performing and started actually listening. The audience had recalibrated. These were experienced fighters. They had the capacity, once the initial shock had passed, to shift from dismissal to genuine analysis. And what they were analyzing now was not the showmanship of a performer, but the mechanics of something they didn't fully understand and needed to. Bruce Lee felt the shift. He always felt it. The quality of attention in a room was information, as readable to him as the weight shift of an opponent's shoulder, the drop of a guard, the 1,000 microsignals that preceded real movement. A room that was watching critically was a different environment than a room that was watching openly. This room was now watching openly, and he gave them something worth watching. He demonstrated the 1-inch punch. If you know the Bruce Lee story, you know this moment. If you don't, understand what it means before you hear how the room responded. A punch generates power through distance, through the accumulation of force as the fist travels from chamber to target, the rotation of the hip, the extension of the shoulder, the chain of muscular engagement that builds momentum across the full arc of the movement. Conventional understanding said you needed that distance, you needed the wind-up. Without it, a punch was a push. Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch began with his fist 1 inch from the target. No wind-up, no chamber, no visible preparation. He asked for a volunteer to hold a focus pad. A big man stepped forward, one of the tournament competitors, broad-shouldered, planted, the kind of physical presence that looks like it would require serious force to move. Bruce Lee set his fist 1 inch from the pad, paused, then fired. The man flew backward, not stumbled, not shifted, flew, 2 steps back, then a third, caught by the people behind him who had to brace to absorb the transfer of energy that had passed through a focus pad and a large body and was still looking for somewhere to go. The room made no sound for a full second, then it made a great deal of sound, because what they had just seen was physically wrong. It violated the intuitive mechanics that every fighter in that room had spent years internalizing. Force requires distance, power requires time. A 1-inch punch should be a push. The man with the focus pad was rubbing his hands together, not injured, but feeling the echo of something that had passed through him in a way that didn't match his experience of being hit.
He looked at Bruce Lee with the specific expression of a man who has just had a foundational assumption removed. "Again," he said. Bruce Lee obliged. Again, the man went back. Ed Parker watched from the side and understood what he was seeing. Not just the technique, he had seen the technique before in private sessions, in the training room conversations that had convinced him to put Bruce on this stage. He was watching the room understand what he already understood. He was watching the American martial arts establishment, proud, hierarchical, certain of its own map, encounter the edge of the map and look over it. That was what he had wanted. That was why Bruce Lee was here. Parker had believed for years, that American martial arts was in danger of calcifying, of becoming too institutional, too concerned with rank and tradition and the preservation of systems for their own sake, rather than the honest question of what actually worked. He had seen it happen. The politics of lineage, the defensive certainty of grandmasters who had stopped asking whether their techniques were true because the question itself felt like betrayal. Bruce Lee asked the question openly, loudly, in front of everyone. That was dangerous and necessary in equal measure. The next demonstration was different in character. Sensitivity training, the Chi-Sa work that Bruce had inherited from Wing Chun and pushed far past its classical boundaries. He asked for a partner, not Carter this time, a different volunteer, a judo practitioner who was known in the room for his exceptional reflexes and his ability to read movement. The drill was simple in description, hands in contact, eyes closed, each practitioner responding to what they felt rather than what they saw. It was not simple in execution, because what it required, what made it work at the level Bruce Lee was operating, was the total absence of anticipation. No prediction, no plan, pure response rooted in the present moment, faster than thought. The judo man was good, he had fast hands and honest reflexes, and he didn't cheat, didn't try to peek, didn't try to impose a pattern, just felt and responded. Bruce Lee was somewhere else entirely. Every time the judo man moved to counter, the target had already relocated. Every time he felt an opening and moved to exploit it, the opening had closed and something else had arrived at his own center line. It lasted 45 seconds. The judo man opened his eyes, stepped back, and said something that the people nearest to him heard clearly. "I can't find him."
Not, "I can't beat him." Not, "He's too fast." "I can't find him." Because that was the experience, not of being outspeed, not of being overpowered, but of reaching for something that declined to be located, of applying your best tools to a problem that kept reorganizing itself before the tools could arrive. Water, filling every space, moving through every opening, taking the shape of whatever container it encountered, and when the container tried to hold it, simply becoming something else. The principle was not new. Bruce had been writing about it, teaching it, building his entire philosophy around it for years. But principle and practice are different things. Philosophy lives in the mind. "I can't find him" lives in the body. The judo man had felt it in his body. That was the difference between understanding Bruce Lee and knowing him. The demonstrations continued for another 40 minutes. Speed drills, kicking technique, the side kick that Bruce Lee threw with a power-to-body-weight ratio that the people measuring it couldn't make consistent with his size. Trapping combinations that moved faster than the eye wanted to parse them into components. Each demonstration produced the same sequence in the audience: initial assessment, surprise, revision, a kind of hunger for more, the specific appetite that opens in serious practitioners when they encounter something that exceeds their current understanding and realize the gap is a place they want to move toward. By the end, the room was not the same room it had been at the beginning. Carter was still there. He had stayed, not out of embarrassment, but out of the same hunger. He had moved closer to the demonstration area as the afternoon progressed, finding angles, watching the footwork, the way Bruce's weight moved, the geometry of the positions he took that made every attack arrive at an already resolved situation. He did not approach Bruce Lee afterward, but 3 weeks later he called Ed Parker and asked for an introduction. He wanted to learn. That transformation, from dismissal to hunger, was not accidental. Bruce Lee understood something about human psychology that many talented people never grasp. That demonstrating superiority is not the same as creating the conditions for someone to receive what you know. He was not performing that afternoon. He was not putting Carter down. He was not using the demonstration to establish dominance in the social hierarchy of the room, a hierarchy he frankly didn't care about. He was showing something true. And he was showing it in a way that left the people watching it with enough dignity to receive it. Carter's second attempt, the combination that had also been neutralized, had been taken seriously. Bruce had let him try again, had not telegraphed the outcome, had not smiled during it, had not looked at the room for reaction. He had simply let the physics speak. That was a form of respect, the kind that says, "I believe you are capable of updating your understanding. I'm not going to humiliate you into it. I'm just going to show you the truth and let you decide what to do with it." That approach, unsentimental but genuinely generous, was as characteristic of Bruce Lee as any technique he ever threw. The 1964 Long Beach Championships produced a specific consequence. His name traveled differently after that afternoon. In the closed world of serious American martial arts, reputation moves through a network of people who trust each other's assessments because they share a common standard. Carter told people, the judo man told people,
The competitors and grandmasters who were watched from the audience went home to their schools and their students and described what they had seen, haltingly, because the language for it was imprecise, but consistently enough that the portrait was recognizable. There was a Chinese martial artist in California who moved in a way that didn't fit the available categories. You needed to see it to understand what that meant. And the people who heard about it and went to see it, who found their way into the training sessions and the demonstrations and the private conversations that Bruce Lee had with anyone who showed genuine interest, those people became the nodes of a network that would eventually carry his ideas into every corner of the martial arts world. One afternoon, one demonstration, 900 seconds in a Long Beach arena, the ripples are still moving. But there is a layer beneath the legend that matters more. Because the story of Long Beach, the version that travels, is about what Bruce Lee did to a room full of skeptics, the speed, the power, the one-inch punch, Carter's expression, the judo man's 3 words. That's the surface. The layer beneath is why he was able to do it. And the answer to that question is not talent, not natural gifts, though those existed, not even the training exactly, though the training was extraordinary in its volume and intelligence and the ruthless honesty with which it was conducted. The answer is what happened in San Francisco in October 1964, 8 months before Long Beach. The Wong Jack Man fight, the walk home, the silence, the decision to hold the gap between what he had done and what he was capable of doing without flinching away from it, to let it live in him as a question rather than a wound, and then to work. Every person in that Long Beach arena who watched Carter through a punch at empty air was watching the product of that decision. Not the talent, the decision. The choice to say, after winning, that winning wasn't enough. The martial arts world remembers 1964 as the year Bruce Lee arrived. That's not wrong, but it is incomplete. He arrived at Long Beach. He had departed from the version of himself that existed before, 8 months earlier, in a bare room in San Francisco, in a fight that 9 people witnessed and nobody filmed. The departure is the real story. Long Beach is just where the rest of the world found out. In the years that followed, Bruce Lee would give many demonstrations, some private, some public, some filmed. The footage that survives from the late 1960s and early 1970s showing a version of him that has crossed from extraordinary into something that resists normal description. The nunchaku speed that film editors initially dismissed as a camera malfunction until they checked the equipment and found nothing wrong. The sidekick that could move a 250-pound heavy bag with a lateral force that physics said his body shouldn't be able to generate. Each of those moments was the same demonstration as Long Beach, not the same techniques, the same truth. That the body is not a fixed instrument, that what a human being is capable of is not determined at birth, and not settled by 30, and not limited by size or weight or the category of tradition you were trained inside. It is determined by the honesty and intelligence and sheer refusal to accept comfortable limitation that you bring to the work. That was what the Long Beach audience saw. Not a prodigy, not a phenomenon in the passive gift from heaven sense. A man who had decided to find out what was actually possible, and then worked with total seriousness and total honesty until he found out. Carter eventually trained with Bruce Lee. Not for long. The geography didn't make it practical, and Bruce's time was increasingly scarce as the decade progressed. But for a period in 1965 he was in the room, feeling what the judo man had described, experiencing from the inside what he had watched from the outside at Long Beach. He has been quoted in at least one account as saying that training with Bruce Lee was the most educational and most humbling experience of his martial arts life. Not because Bruce made it humbling, but because the truth is humbling when you finally stop defending yourself against it and let it in. The man who called Bruce Lee an actor, who said it loud enough to carry across the room to the people sitting nearby who laughed. He never said it again, not because he was afraid of being wrong in public. He was past that kind of pride by the time the demonstration ended, but because the word had become inapplicable in a way that was permanent and obvious. Actors perform for audiences. What Bruce Lee did that afternoon was not for the audience. It was true whether anyone was watching or not. It would have been exactly as true in an empty room, the same speed, the same precision, the same outcome. The audience didn't create it, they just got to witness it. There is a difference, and it matters, and it is the whole difference between someone who has built something real and someone who has built the appearance of something real. One of them works when no one is watching. The other one requires the audience to exist at all. Be like water. He said it first, and he said it last, and he said it every way a thing can be said, in interviews, in notebooks, in the private conversations that his students have been quoting for 50 years because they have never found better words for the thing he was pointing at. Water has no shape of its own. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. It moves around obstacles without deciding to. It finds every opening without planning. It is the softest substance, and given enough time and pressure, the most unstoppable force in the natural world. The Long Beach audience expected a shape, a system, a style, a known thing from a known tradition that could be categorized and assessed against the existing map. Bruce Lee had no shape. He had a principle, a direction, a commitment to following the truth of a situation wherever it led, without the rigidity of style or the defensiveness of tradition, or the ego investment of a man who needed to be right more than he needed to be real.
That was what Carter's punch had found. Nothing to hit. Not because Bruce Lee wasn't there, but because he was so completely there, so fully present, so totally responsive, that the space a punch needed to land simply didn't exist. You cannot hit what will not be fixed. You cannot stop what has no shape to stop. The championships ended that evening. Trophies were given. Champions were recognized. The hierarchy of the American martial arts world reassembled itself around its familiar structures: rank, lineage, competitive record, the accumulated status of years inside the system. Bruce Lee collected nothing. He was not competing. He had no rank in any of the systems the trophies represented. He left the arena the way he had arrived, without ceremony, without entourage, with the particular self-containment of someone who was not waiting for external confirmation of anything. But the room he left was permanently different from the room he had entered. The questions he had planted, not in speeches, not in philosophy, but in the body of every fighter who had watched Carter's punch land on nothing. Those questions were going home with the audience. What am I assuming that isn't true? What am I protecting that I should be questioning? What would I find if I held my techniques up to the honest light of, does this actually work? Those questions are still working. In every mixed martial arts gym where a fighter cross-trains across styles. In every coach who teaches their athlete to read the attack before it arrives rather than respond after. In every serious practitioner who has really understood, in their body and not just their mind, that the style is not the truth. The truth is underneath the style. Bruce Lee went to Long Beach to show a room full of champions where to look. Most of them spent the rest of their lives looking. Subscribe. Because if you're still here, if this story found something in you that wants more, then you understand what this channel is actually about. Not mythology, not hero worship, not the comfortable legend of a man so gifted that his achievements belong to another category of human being entirely. The uncomfortable truth that what Bruce Lee built was built. Deliberately, painfully, through a series of honest confrontations with his own limitations, the kind of confrontations most people spend their lives avoiding. He was not born what he became. He decided to become it. And then he worked. Every week on this channel we find another room, another moment before the myth, another decision that made everything else possible. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.